Well, hello, everybody, and here we are with the continuing saga of Dr. Douglas Gabriel and the interviews with the exorcist. And today we're going to continue on into Douglas's adventures in the Motor City. Douglas, how are you?
I'm doing well, John, but I was up late last night thinking about this broadcast. As you know, we had decided to do a different topic. And then last night, when I decided that really there was no way to tell my story without having a clear understanding of why it is I came to Detroit, what I was doing in Detroit, and how I ended up being involved in so many strange and peculiar things that required the talents of a clairvoyant. So I'm going to tell a little bit of that story today, if you don't mind.
Well, that sounds perfect. Again, I've known you for 45, 50 years, and I'm still finding out because, we don't when we commiserate, we don't go on and on about all this stuff. Oh, I did this, I did that. So I don't. A lot of this stuff I don't even know. So this is even more fun for me than it is for other people.
Well, it's very painful for me because I don't think about these things. They're in the far past, and I really don't like to think about them. But there's really no way to explain it, and there needs to be this background. A backdrop needs to be placed there so that we can have the ability in the future to make reference to these things. So this is the story. And last night it was very strange when I decided that I needed to do a talk, basically, which I would say is referencing things like ghost hunting and evil priests in the Catholic Church. That just as I thought that, and I said, yes, I'm going to do that. And I'll call John and tell him I'm changing it. The light in the room went out, a brand new light. There's nothing wrong with it. And it just went out. And Tyler came in and said, what's this? I said, well, the light went out. I don't know. It's very common that even as a child, sometimes I'd walk into a room and a radio would turn on and start playing. But it was some kind of garbled, weird language or something, and people would look at the radio and say, "I didn't turn that on." They'd go over and find out that the radio is not even on, and then they'd unplug it, and this strange noise would still come through. So wherever I've lived in my life, somehow I was inexplicably drawn to or connected to haunted houses and very disturbing, um, evil spiritual circumstances. Now, some might say, well, that's just part of the curse, and you're being used by the spirit. Yeah, but it got really old after a while, let me tell you. So, the stories I'm going to tell today, some of them you know, some of them you were there, some of them you witnessed. And it starts off by I need to say, first off, that I was in Detroit. Again, I'll repeat this for a short period of time before I moved back to Detroit permanently. So when I moved back to Detroit, because I was still connected to the Jesuits, and my mission was to see what good things could be drawn out of Rudolf Steiner's work and out of the curriculum of the Waldorf schools, which Rudolf Steiner founded. That's what I had made this promise to do, and I was trying to live up to that promise. So when I moved back, I was still a Jesuit. And basically, as soon as I got back, I was assigned to stay at the Jesuit house. Now, many of the things I'm going to say today, I had to think about this a lot last night. I can't really mention some of these names or exact places because this is what happens. When that is done, then people who are seeking glamour, people who are seeking some kind of thrill, people who love to be scared, they'll immediately go to these places and think that they can, be a Ghostbuster or imbibe in this. And now there's TV shows, literally, where a lot of them, lots of them, where these kind of supernatural things from the unseen world are put on the big screen and or on television series, things like the movie Constantine. Someone, and this person knows because he's contacted me since I mentioned him a couple talks ago. A brilliant young man, and he wanted to say, "Will you please teach me to be an exorcist?" And I responded, "I wouldn't do that to my worst enemy, let alone to a dear friend." It's the last thing that you'd ever want to encounter. And the things I'm going to tell you now, I ask that you do not play this podcast for any child or anyone young or anyone who's a thrill seeker or someone who thinks that it's glamorous to be a Ghostbuster, because there is nothing glamorous about it. In every case, you will be exposed to horrible, horrible things, things that no human really needs to know. And that's the reason a lot of this stuff was kept secret, is because, first off, the Catholic Church buried it. And as you know, just for instance, in this area right here, there's 600 cases that literally priests were charged with assaulting, sexually assaulting children, boys and girls and women. And there were 1,600 other cases that were pending. So 2,200 cases just in this area. And you might remember that some years ago, when Pope Benedict XVI was the Pope, I like to call him Pope Ratzinger, who I believe is not a Christian, never was a Christian, and is literally pure evil. But he followed right after Pope John Paul II, who was a saint. So I'm not saying or trying to condemn the Catholic Church or in any way trying to point fingers at anyone, because that's not what I'm trying to accomplish here today. What I'm trying to accomplish is to give you a realistic view of someone who has been through these things, and I do not take it lightly, and I do not recommend it. And as they say, do not try this at home. So here goes. I moved to Detroit, and immediately I was given not really an assignment. They said you can live at the Jesuit house. And most people don't even know there is a Jesuit house in this area. And right across the street was a church, and I'm not going to mention the name of that church. I'm not going to mention the city that it's in either, because then people would go there and thrill seekers would try to see if they could have some kind of pseudo spiritual experience, as well as the devil worshippers now are just legion. They're everywhere. There's literally a church. The largest church for Satan worship is in this area. And that's not by accident. And so all these things I'm going to tell you, I'm going to explain why some of them happened, and some of them I can't explain. And some of them I was able to help the situation get better, and some I couldn't. And to this very day, they still exist. And I don't want to send people there because and I don't want to tell them exactly where it is, because it's gets very dicey. Let's put it that way. So I had the choice of moving either to the University of Detroit, which is a Jesuit university, and staying in the dormitory there. I checked that out, and it had really bad energy. And that I was offered a place at Mercy College in their dormitory, and that too I didn't like that for a variety of reasons. Nothing that was horrible. And then basically they said, well, this is where the house of formation is. So the young men who go into this house, this Jesuit house, go to a local high school. And for those years, they're in spiritual development, religious development classes at the Jesuit house, and also sometimes taking courses at the University of Detroit, as well as finishing their high school diploma. So I said, okay, that's fine. So I go to this place. Now, mind you, I had my own vehicle. I was quite independent. The Catholic Church, I had a strange arrangement with them, very strange. So I was considered a priest, but I did not say Mass. And I didn't do the Holy Eucharist. I didn't want to. I wanted to be a philosopher. So I go to this place, and like it had happened in 2 of the 3 previous places I'd been, St. Regis, Rockhurst University, and St. Louis University. Unfortunately, the person who was the abbot or the head of that house was well, what would you call it? A sexual pervert. And these were young men, and he basically was a very aggressive homosexual who, to me, the first time I sat down and talked with him, I realized he's not even a spiritual person. He's just this kind of predator monster. And so I stayed there one night and realized that this place was terribly haunted. And so I was trying to figure out what that was about. And then the next 2 nights, he came into my room and tried to molest me. So I had been trained in jujitsu and judo and in the military, hand-to-hand combat, and I wasn't anyone to mess with, and I warned anyone like this because I could see that that was their nature. Make sure you don't do that. And so he tried to molest me. And so I grabbed his hand and twisted it and pressed a pressure point, and he lost the sensation in his hand for quite some time, I understand. And I went and I reported him. And I also reported the fact that I had seen, and this is where it gets very dicey, in the backyard of this house was a tree, oh, maybe 20 years old or something. And I could see that a young man had hung himself there. And I knew that it was one of the priests in formation. But I also realized that there was a much greater history to this place. I didn't know what it was, but I believed that it was previously a convent, and that what happens so oftentimes in convents is the priests have sex, unwanted sex. They rape the nuns, they have babies, and those babies are out of wedlock and they're hidden. They try to hide it in the Catholic Church. And you've seen this up in Canada, you've seen it all over America, where they take these babies, these unwanted babies, they can't put them in a consecrated ground in the graveyard. So they bury them in the back of the convent. And so I was convinced that this had happened and that there was at least one child buried exactly underneath the place where this young man had hung himself. So I went and reported that to the priest who was running the diocese right next door, the church, the congregational priest, and reported this to him. And as I'm reporting it to him, I'm realizing that he's a pedophile. And I'm thinking, this is disgusting. So I knew that would go nowhere. But all the young men who were there were only about 4 or 5 in that Jesuit house. They were all extraordinarily depressed, and I could tell that they had, in fact, been molested. So I took it right up the ladder immediately. I went and I talked to the bishop and archbishop, and then Father Cardinal Dearden. Cardinal Dearden was a very compassionate, holy man. And I explained what I saw. And he said, well, what are we going to do about this? And he actually knew of Father William Bresnahan, the priest who had taught me to be an exorcist. And so he took me quite seriously. So I said, well, first off, I need to know the name before I can help this situation. I need to know the name of that young man. And I need to look at some records, some Catholic records, to find out if what my other suspicions are true, which I really don't want to say until I can pretty much demonstrate this. Because as you know, to get rid of an obsession or a possession, you need to know the name of the demon. And specifically, you need to know the name of the person that this has happened to. And so without that, there wasn't a lot I could do. So he was a very kind, wonderful person. And though I believed in the end that he was complicit with a lot of the sexual abuse going on in his diocese, which was a very large, the archdiocese was very large, a lot of churches, a lot of priests. And of course, he knew that these things were happening, but, by then, it was probably about 10 years after that the Catholic Church was charged in America with crimes, and they paid $4.5 billion in hush money. And this went out to all the different cities in America. And these thousands of people, I forget how many thousands of people had brought these claims. And so technically, the way this worked out was the decision was made that the Catholic Church was a corporation and that the head of the corporation is the Pope. And that the Pope is the only person liable. Because in the old days, the police would not prosecute a priest. They would look into it was so Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, took it upon himself to say, yes, responsibility for all of the abuse throughout the whole world. And I am the CEO of this corporation, and I'm going to step down. And then he went to a part of the Vatican City and stayed there for the rest of his life, basically so that no one could be prosecuted, because this essentially bankrupted many dioceses in America when they had to pay out 4.5 billion just in America. So I believe that Cardinal Dearden and later Cardinal um, Sorka, or that was his name, Sorka, yeah, Cardinal. He was a good man too, and he followed after Dearden. And both of them I became fast friends with. They allowed me to get into the Catholic records, historical records. And so I was looking up this Jesuit house. I found also in microfiche the record of this young man hanging himself, but they swept it under the rug. I did find out it was a convent, and I couldn't find out much more than that. And so basically, when I had given him my report after I had studied this, it was one of the first things I was ever given to do when I came to Detroit. Um, so I told him, well, first off, I'm going to attempt to help that spirit move on. And I'll explain why those things happen and in a little while. But I found the name of the person, so I was able to address this shell. In this case, it was an etheric shell because it had connected to the tree that the young man had hung himself in. And so I was able to address him and say, you're dead and you need to move on. And he says, well, I can't unless there's justice. And so my actions in many of these cases was seen by these shells. These aren't the I am of the person. These are shells, astral shells, etheric shells, physical shells in some cases. So the person, this young man, moved on. And then I asked that the tree be cut down and that the spot that I had pointed out be that they dig in to the ground and basically exhume the child that had been buried there. And they did that. And then Father Dearden, after this, when they found the body, when some of the young men felt a lot better staying there, and they got rid of that priest who was the abbot, more or less the abbot of that Jesuit house, they moved him on, as they often do. They just move him to another area. They move him to another area of the country, and they continue to commit the same crimes, is what usually happens. So he became very much a person who trusted me and trusted the things that I had been taught and that I could still help with. Because in those days I was not sick and didn't have to take med pills for pain, so I was able to still do these things. So I became fast friends with him. And so the next thing he said to me is, okay, well, I have a problem. The problem is the largest house in Detroit, personal home, belonged to Bishop Gallagher in the far past history. And this place has been so haunted that I can't get anyone to live there. And yet we own it. And they didn't want to sell it because it was a beautiful mansion. So strangely enough, and this is where it gets really strange, I can't say this person's name because he's still around. Matter of fact, I ended up teaching one of his children at the Waldorf school. Very strange indeed. He was going to buy this house, but he'd been told there's poltergeists running through this house. This house is haunted as can be. No one wants to live there. And so he said, no, I'm not scared of ghosts. So he moved into the house, and then he was going to move out immediately because things were being thrown around in the room, poltergeist action all over the house, screaming noises. He was scared to death. His children were scared to death. His wife was scared to death. And so they said, we just paid millions of dollars for this place. I'm moving out. You guys didn't tell me this. You did not disclose this in the agreement when I bought this house. So the cardinal asked me, can you go there and do something about this? So that started a long history of years and years of getting a call from the archdiocese and saying, can you come down? We want to talk to you. And every time it was a test. They didn't help me. They didn't tell me what they knew. They just said, go check this out and then come back, make a report, and then do what you're going to do. Well, in this case, they said, go there, get rid of the poltergeist. So I went there, and everyone knows this person's name. You know this person, and he became a very good friend of ours, especially Bobby and mine, and he had tremendous respect for us because when I went in there, I went into the room of the master bedroom, and in this closet, the poltergeist was throwing things at me as I went into the room. It's like, okay, this is really easy to figure out what's going on here. So I talked to the spirit and found out that he'd been raped, molested, killed, and buried in the backyard. Standard operating procedure for evil priests, right? So I had to work on this a little bit, but he was having this person, I almost said his name, I should be careful, was having this big party inviting all the biggest names in Detroit and the whole state. As a matter of fact, it's when I met the guy who became the mayor later. And so I worked on this case for a while, trying to figure out if I could get the name of this person. I couldn't get the name of the person, but in the end, a lot of prayer, a lot of fasting, and certain rituals were done, and the spirit was cleared. And then this basketball player lived in that house quite peacefully. And of course, they exhumed the body, and of course, that did not make it to the news. Neither did the child's body that was found at the Jesuit house. It did not make it into the news. Now, Alligator Alley. You know that story. You were there. You were playing the games, and I wasn't playing the games, and you and Bob were playing the games. And then the owner said to me, well, I could hear people screaming, right? And I'm just walking around, and people would scream, and they turn around and see what had just poked them, and they would freak out, and then they get scared and they'd run out. And so I said to the manager, you have some weird things going on here. He goes, I know. I brought in psychics. I brought in this, I brought in that, and I can't figure it out. So why are you asking? I said, well, I may be able to help you. Tell me how this has been going. He says, well, ever since I bought this place, this has been happening. People sometimes see weird images of ugly things in the screen looking back at them. Sometimes they're poked, sometimes they're attacked, so on and so forth. So I say, okay, well, let me work on this. So I checked out the place, and I realized it wasn't there. It was coming from the ground. So I'm standing at this big wall. I think I think when you and Bob came out, I'm standing at a wall, praying in the wall and saying, it's on the other side of this wall. And the wall was a big, long wall all the way out to the street. And so I went around the wall and looked at this house. Instantaneously, I knew that this had been where the pregnant nuns were sent to have their babies from the. Now, this one what made the news, and this was known, so I can say this. It was Father Coughlin, right? You you know about that, right? Everybody
Well,
knows about
yeah,
that.
when my grandma would come visit us, we lived in the area. She'd go have lunch with Father Coughlin. Of course, if she'd have known any of that, she'd have turned him in a minute. But her father was he owned the construction company that built the cathedral and many of those big homes and the Ford plant and all this stuff. So she was in the mix with all that and knew all the bishops. And, I knew now he's Cardinal Maida, but he was the bishop here at one time. Maybe you knew him. I don't
Mhm.
know. But yeah, that was the story that was in the news, definitely.
So Father how do you say his name? Co
Father Coughlin
Coughlin.
he
Yeah.
was the largest radio personality way back, in the 40s, and he would do these broadcasts, and he was anti-communist, and it would get broadcast all over the country, and so he was the biggest personality on the radio during that period.
And so I saw this house. I knew immediately what was going on. So I went back and said, listen, I can guarantee you, I can point to the spot. You're going to dig up a number of skeletons of babies. And this came from Father Coughlin. I always call him Coughlin.
It's Coughlin,
Coughlin, Couglin, I think is the way it's spelled.
good old Irish name.
Yes. Now he was incredibly charismatic, and he built a beautiful church. Oh, one of the most beautiful churches around, called the Shrine of the Little Flower. Well, I was in that diocese, and we went to church there. And every time I go to church there, it was horrible because the priests were overtly homosexual. They showed everybody every time in the congregation. Pretty soon, it made us so sick we couldn't go there. But strangely enough, 3 of my children were baptized there. And then there was a convent. and there was a school next door. So whenever there's a convent and a school next door and some kind of charismatic younger priest, you can just count on something going wrong. But at the same time, there are Stations of the Cross right outside of the church was sacred. There was manifestations of Mary, which I was asked to check out. And yes, it was really true. These nuns were so devout that when they were doing the Stations of the Cross and doing those spiritual practices, sometimes this lady would appear. She never spoke to any of them, but they would witness her. And I saw this lady, and I assumed that that was, a continuation of Mother Mary's promise also to manifest to the faithful who say the rosary. Well, I was addicted to saying the rosary. I'd say the rosary sometimes 3 times a day. And so I would be asked to look into that, and I went and looked into that. And they did dig up the bodies, and that house, nobody would live in that house. That house was so deserted. It was just like the Jesuit house. You looked at it and you knew that it was haunted. I mean, I think a normal person could look at it and see that it was haunted. So this made the news, and then because of that, and because my name was attached to it, which it shouldn't have been, it wasn't supposed to be, then I would get calls from all over America sometimes for places that were haunted, that were causing real problems, and even in the public, I was noted for this. A matter of fact, I was called a Ghostbuster. I was called a person who could cast out demons and stuff like this, which I never ever wanted to advertise. So I kept that very low key. But again and again, the archdiocese would call and say, "Will you go out to?" And I can say this one because it's a good one. Can you go out to St. Mary's College on Pontiac Lake and check out the grotto there? They didn't tell me why. So I went there, and by golly, here's Mother Mary appearing there. Also the church in Greektown. What's the name of that one? St. Catherine, St. Anne's? I can't remember. But it had a Mary grotto also. And so I would go there and say, yes, this is very real. And not many people witnessed it. And so the Catholic Church always likes to control those things. They don't want it to get out. They don't want to say that they ratify it. As a matter of fact, someone from the Vatican has to come and do an incredibly long study before you can ratify that any true apparition of Mary or any manifestation of an angel is real. So they would use me as the person to just go tell us what's going on there if you can, and blah, blah, blah. So I was called many times. I think I described one here not long ago with you where they called me to Chicago, and it was a Satanistic group, and it was a whole horrible thing. But this was verified again and again, so they learned to trust me. So when the archdiocese would get a call from a hospital where someone who was Catholic might even be in a I forget the name of these hospitals. One of them was a Jewish hospital, and one was Bon Secours, one was Ford Hospital, all these different hospitals, as well as the insane asylums, Hawthorne, the one out in Pontiac, the Leland. They would get people there who they said were possessed. And so I would go and check it out. And this is after they'd already seen doctors and psychiatrists, and they literally didn't know what else to do. And so it would filter up to the archdiocese, and they would send me out. Now, this is the point. The point is, I'm 20 years old. There were hundreds of priests in Detroit in those days and in the surrounding areas. Not a one of them had the capacity to discern or to help with a possession, and certainly not to do an exorcism. And now I was 20, I'm 60, so that was 48 years ago. So things have changed radically now, that people think that they can do off the cuff exorcisms, which in fact, you'll see lots of interviews on, you can go on YouTube and see interviews of parish priests telling you that they did an exorcism and that the person was growling at them and this and that happened and things were flying around the room. And you go, yeah, and you're lucky you're still alive, because this is the most dangerous game you can play. Because once you get in front of a demon, they're going to call you out for your sins. And everyone who's there or everyone who hears about this is going to know it. And you are going to feel really, really bad when the devil confronts you, because once you know the devil exists, then you know God exists. And the unseen world, the trick of the unseen world is to make sure nobody knows they exist, whether it's God or whether it's the devil. That's the whole point of free will.
Yeah, it's disconcerting because they know more about you than you do. And but when you get into the types of problems that Douglas discussing here, you're getting into the domain of two particular types of entities: the entities of Mammon and the entities of Asmodeus. And these are fallen spirits of lust and greed and pestilence and well, also Mammon is money, so it tends to go hand in hand. And so you have this fallen nature of mankind, and this is what we're struggling with. And like Douglas has said in other episodes, that people give beings permission, and that's when the trouble begins.
Absolutely. They, these evil priests, they are absolutely in league with the devil. And if they're saying a mass in a church, that's not consecration. That is a black mass. It's not a holy Eucharist. And unfortunately, many of these priests are parish priests who are basically act with impunity. They get caught. It's like all there's multiple hospitals in America where they have to send the priests who become alcoholic. There's multiple places where they send these molesters to try to get them to break the habit. They don't necessarily kick them out of the church. These are crimes, folks. These people need to go to jail. These people need to be prosecuted. And the reason that ghosts hang out oftentimes is because justice was not done. In many of these cases, it was around traumatic death. And traumatic death, especially for a young person, leaves an unused etheric body. And so that's what you're contacting. The etheric body won't dissolve because there wasn't justice done. They might have been murdered or other horrible things. And so you can literally talk to the shell of these people if they were evil and their ghost hung out because they were evil. That's usually an astral shell. If they were murdered or had horrifying trauma, that's oftentimes an etheric shell. But sometimes they literally leave physical residue uh, because they were young, they were abused by evil, someone who was literally obsessed or possessed by a demon. And that's when the poltergeists happen. That's when things start to fly around the room. That's when you start to see all kinds of strange balls of light or cold. The etheric shell often produces cold spots. So you can, even a normal person can walk into a house they think is kind of spooky, walk around into some place, just go, oh my gosh, I'm getting terrible chills right now. I feel like I'm being frozen to death. I'm stiff. I mean, I can barely move. I mean, literally, this happens to people who don't have any psychic capacity or clairvoyant capacity. So this was something that became a regular routine. And I was trying to remember last night all the different times that I'd been called to do house blessings or to assess a situation to see if there was a demonic possession or these kind of things. I never charged any money for it. There was one other lady who I think you remember, who was a lady who said she was an American Indian, and she would charge $500 to go to your house and get rid of the spirit, and she'd burn some incense, and people would say, throw dirt around the house, supposedly sacred dirt, and then charge them $500, and of course nothing would happen. So oftentimes those people would call the Mayflower Bookshop and say, do you know where I can get a hold of an exorcist? Or do you know someone who can get rid of a haunted spirit in a house? And our dear friend Robert would, help them out as much as he could. You'd help them out as much as you could. But in the end, many times these people would call me and I would go to their place. Now, let me make this clear. You can have a haunting in a holy place. Okay. Now, people would think that's very weird, but it's absolutely true. Matter of fact, it oftentimes is hand in glove. So the Shrine of the Little Flower had this evil priest and later had many evil priests who were said mass there. But the sisters, that were the teachers at the school across the street, they were holy, they were sacred, they were beautiful. And so they were taken advantage of by these people. And they literally went to church and took mass, took Holy Communion from evil priests.
Well, your average individual doesn't know this, but within the Catholic Church itself, there's an actual power block within the cardinals. They call them the pink cardinals, and that's that homosexual branch of and they're very powerful. And so, what are they supposed to do?
As a matter of fact, the pink cardinals instead of red cardinals have recently tried to convince our very evil Pope Francis that homosexuality should be allowed for priests and that they should be able to give communion to homosexuals. Now, of course, that's 100% against the Catholic doctrine and dogma, but the kind of evil, recently I did a show just by myself where I gave a warning about a new movie that was coming out called The Pope's Exorcist. And it was all about Father Gabriel Amorth. And as I said, he's more possessed than practically any of the people he worked on. He claims he's done 70,000 exorcisms, but out of them, only 46 of them were really possessed. And so he says he did 46 exorcisms. But look closely at what he says. Some of those exorcisms, he had to do 7, 8, 9 different exorcisms on one person. So we're talking about in all of his 30 years that it was only a few people who were actually possessed. But what did he do? He convinced 70,000. Now 600,000 people have had recorded supposed exorcisms from the Vatican in Italy alone. Why? Because this evil priest taught everybody the wrong approach to this and tried to make it that it was common and that it was only he who could cast out the demons and stuff. No, we're talking extraordinarily rare priests are ever allowed to do the rite of exorcism. So don't think for one second that what I'm telling you I take lightly.
Yeah, in fact, it came out in the news within the last year or two that the Pope announced that they'd rewritten the rites of exorcism and shortened them. And these are sacred rites going way back, and even Muslims will bring in a priest if they for an exorcism if they have a problem of that nature, and rabbis do too. So this is a very serious office that's been in position. You have to understand that the beginning of Christianity in the first few centuries, the Christian communities were centers of healing and exorcism. That's what they did. And all of the apostles were exorcists.
Yes, and when they tried the witches, they would first try an exorcism on them, and then they'd give them the witches' trial, which were stupid. They weighed them against a duck. If they weighed more than a duck, then they were possessed. There's a priest who was before Father Amorth. His name was Candido Amaniti. And my priest, Father William, who trained me at one point said, "This is the man I'm going to take you to Rome to meet. And if he approves, you're going to stay there and you're going to finish your training as an exorcist." And he was a holy man, as far as Father William told me, and as far as I can find out in history. But then his successor, and by the way, when he was the Vatican exorcist, he said there were only 10 exorcists in the world. 3 of them were in America. One of them was Father William. And so Father William, he never told me this, but he would have had to have trained with Father Candido. And the new one, oh no, he's opened up an international exorcist group, which has thousands of members, and they talk about it like it's nothing. What are they really doing? They're promoting evil. And so right there, you can see from one holy pope, a saint, to a totally evil pope, to a completely evil pope. And when I say evil, people may get very upset that I call Francis a possessed person. But As far as I'm concerned, anyone who promotes open borders is complicit with murder, murder from fentanyl, from drugs, from human trafficking, from sex trafficking, from the people who die in the attempt to cross these borders to try to get to a better place. I don't hold it against the people. I hold it against the politicians. I hold it against the members of the church like Francis. I mean, his thing is open borders. He gets, he's washed the feet of these supposed immigrants, even though, remember, he only took 10 into the Vatican and then he kicked them all out just a few weeks later. So the Vatican City has never taken in an immigrant and helped them, but he washes the feet of the immigrants and yells, more or less, preaches, I should say, open borders, which is murder. There is no other way to look at it. He is responsible for murder because he's telling these people to go to these borders, cross them, and telling the countries to let them in.
Yeah, he's basically an agent of chaos. And really, if you go back, there's a guy who was head of the FBI office in California, in Los Angeles, Ted Gunderson. He's very famous. A lot of the stuff that he was dealing with has now become public. Now people are starting to wonder, hey, what's going on? Hey, why is it that in in the state of Virginia that they're number two for missing children when they're only about in the middle as far as the amount of population. They're number two behind California. So what's up with that? And you look, well, what's in Virginia? Well, you have a lot of government people and offices and all of that. So there really is a systemic problem going on.
Yes, now there's some extenuating circumstances here. For instance, why is Detroit filled with so many of these cases? Well, let's look back to the history of Detroit. Fort Pontchartrain. When Fort Pontchartrain was built, it basically they had to kill a bunch of Indians who had a village there to begin with. And some people have debated this with me, but I've gone to the records, and you can plug in a search and say haunted places in Detroit. I've been to all those places. And what they give as their excuse or reasons for some of these hauntings are complete and absolute nonsense. They're just urban legends. So let me explain a few things. So Fort Pontchartrain was first off a place where the British and the French battled, and the Indians, the Iroquois, the Potawatomi, the Chippewa, the Fox, a whole bunch of Indian tribes were at different points on different sides of this battle. But before the first fort was built, Fort Pontchartrain, they had to wipe out an Indian village. And so this caused a gigantic battle that raged on for a long time. And there was an Indian hero here named Chief Pontiac. Well, Chief Pontiac was in a big battle with Fort Pontchartrain, which was sometimes called Fort Detroit. And they had a battle at Blood Run. They also had a giant battle at the Raisin River. And if you go down to Monroe, which is not far from here, matter of fact, it's just a suburb basically of Detroit, and you go to that memorial there, you still see, just like, when General Patton would look at a battlefield, he'd actually see the battle before his eyes. He'd actually witnessed the battle being reenacted. Well, this is the same thing that I'd experience, especially when I go to old places, especially in Europe, or if I'd go to battlefields. As a matter of fact, in the backyard of my house, there was a giant field. And I went out there one day and as a child and looked at this creek going through there, and I saw this bridge, and I went over there and I started digging in the ground and started finding bullets and arrowheads and all kinds of things. Later, it was turned into the Battle Creek Memorial. I think it might even be a national memorial. Same like Raisin River, it's a national memorial. It's a haunted ground. It is where people were murdered for very bad reasons. So right there at Blood Creek, it's called, or it's called the Battle of Bloody Run, I think, was inside. Later was the only place in Detroit where they didn't level the ground and they left the original landscape the way that it was. because the battle between Chief Pontiac and Fort Detroit was fought there, and hundreds, I think, well, 500-600 people died there until this creek ran with blood, and so it was called Blood Creek. Well, I used to hang out there. One of my dear friends, Faith Foster, who you knew quite well, we'd go there and we'd lunch in these places in front of the mausoleums of the richest barons of Detroit. So this place was massively haunted, Elmwood Cemetery. But everybody knows this, and so I'm not telling anything that's new. But I spent a lot of time there doing a lot of prayer and trying to help a lot of these spirits transition, but they wouldn't transition. So when you get kind of a group soul trauma death, like a battlefield, it doesn't dissolve. It doesn't dissolve sometimes for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But go right across the fence and you got the Catholic cemetery. And right across the street from that was where Father Solinus, who they made a saint, the Capuchin monastery there. He was a saint. There he is. And they have all of his stuff there in a museum, and they actually have his casket in an open space where people go and kneel down and pray right on top of his casket. And it's like the guy's never left. And he could heal people by taking a handkerchief, blessing it, and sending it to them. He was a true saint. They made him a saint, and it takes a lot to be made a saint, especially if you're just a humble priest. So right next to the evilest place there was, maybe in all of Detroit, was a holy saint. So it's very peculiar the way that this works. Now, Fort Detroit was extended along the Jefferson Avenue there, and three of the oldest brick homes, and they were, well, one of them was glacial stones that were made into these stone houses. Well, one of them to this very day is called the Players Theater or the Players Guild. It's a little theater for amateur people, and it's haunted as can be. And they say, it's because a creek runs underneath it that was Blood Creek. That was, this was the creek that went through Elmwood. No, that was a completely different creek. Had it been the Elmwood Creek, it would have been horrifying. In this case, it was just they'd hear voices and they'd hear weird things and things would happen and blah, blah, blah. And so I went there. They asked me to come there and see if I could get rid of it. And I said, well, no, there's a creek running right underneath this. If you have a creek running underneath your house, you are going to have elemental possession. You don't put your creek on top of a house. Your house on top of a creek. And this was the case many times. I'd go to a house and I'd say, okay, here's the problem. When they built this apartment, it's illegal to do this, as a matter of fact. You can't build an apartment or a house on top of an active creek, but unless you put it into metal conduit or whatever those things are called that can carry water underground. And so I'd walk into the house and I'd go, well, this is very easy. I'd take a mirror and I'd point it at where the water was coming. And then I'd go to the other end of the house and put a mirror going the way that it was flowing. Boom, no more bad spirits in the house. Or I'd go into a house and they had put iron grates on every window and every door. And then they were surprised that there was an elemental possession of the house. And so in many of the cases, people have to literally move out of these houses because there's really nothing you can do. And it's very rare to find somebody who can help you figure this out. Or in the case of what I'm about to tell you, you do not build houses on top of an Indian burial ground. So in Detroit, there's a thing called Fort Wayne. Sometimes it gets mixed up. It's called Fort Detroit. No, it's Fort Wayne. There was never a battle fought there, but many men who went off to war mustered there. And when they came back, they were wounded. And so this place was filled. You can literally, still to this day, you can go there. Every time I've ever been there, and you can see men marching around as if they're marching off to war. The company I worked for was given all of Fort Wayne to be a center for adjudicated youth. And so I got to go in and go through the whole thing. And then I'm going, well, this isn't haunted by these soldiers. This was the Springwell people, the Hopewell people were there. They wiped them out and they put them in a giant mound that is still there today. So it was a massacre and a group burial that is still there today. So the first time I ever went there, I saw this mound and I went, what is going on? What is that? Why would they leave that there? I walked up on the mountain. I'm like, oh my God, hundreds of people were massacred and they're underneath this. It took a lot of research to figure this out, but we did figure it out. And then no, we would take the children out there. They were all so spooked by the place that we had to turn down the offer of the city of Detroit to give us this land because our schools, we had a bunch of schools, because people were terrified of it. And they're still terrified of it to this very day.
Yeah, the namesake of Mad Anthony Wayne. He was a military guy. There's Fort Wayne, Indiana. Wayne County is the county of the city of Detroit. And so he was a big deal. And well, they called him Mad Anthony Wayne. What more do you need to know?
Precisely. Precisely. So to this day, they say that everyone who goes in the visitor center there usually walks out and says, no, we don't want a tour of the place. We've seen enough. That's it. They walk in and just a normal person says, I'm getting out of here. Matter of fact, in the entire time that we were researching this place and we'd go out there was never anyone there ever, except for someone in the visitor center. And they had artifacts, and the artifacts carry memory. Like I was saying, sometimes it's a physical thing. So there was nothing that I could do with that place. Absolutely nothing. So in the end, we had to literally turn down a gift that was so big, it was ludicrously ridiculous. Well, another story. I ended up studying anthroposophy and Waldorf education in a place called Indian Village. 3 streets running off of Jefferson down by the river, going up, maybe 6, 8 blocks. And they were named Iroquois, Seminole, and Burns. Now, why were they named Burns? Why were they named Seminole and Iroquois? It was because, and people argued with me one time when I did a talk on this, and they said, no, you're absolutely wrong. No Indians ever lived there. I didn't say Indians lived there. It was an Indian burial ground. The same exact thing that caused and causes to this very day the haunting of the Detroit Library, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Whitney Building, and the Ferry Building. That's all right. It was some miles north of where the Fox Indians and the Chippewa and the Potawatomi lived down by the river. And that was their sacred burial ground. You don't go and build houses on that, especially if you hadn't, in many cases, depend on the Indian tribe. Sometimes they'd go up and just put their body up on a tall thing above the earth. Sometimes they'd bury them. But the point is, this was sacred ground. They never did anything to clear it. They never asked the Indians who were buried there if they could use this land. So the Whitney, it was so bothersome that they, in their restaurant, this is the fanciest, most expensive restaurant in Detroit, people would go there and they'd see these balls of light rolling around. I mean, they took pictures of them. They took moving pictures of them, right? And they were moving around and they'd scare people and they'd kind of chase people and people would, and they'd run away. So finally they asked some holy people to come in and they did a bunch of prayers. And what happened was those balls rose up to their 3rd floor and it became a glamorous place to go to have a drink, to watch these balls of light roam around the room. But in the basement, so when I was asked by the Archdiocese to please help these people who own this restaurant, I went in there and I said, well, this is very clear what happened. Let me guess. The people who built this house died in this house under strange circumstances, right? And they said, yeah, that's correct. I said, well, you're looking in the wrong place. Let me show you. I took them down to the basement. I said, no, stand here a while. Turn off all the lights. What do you see? Millions of little white specks floating around. And you see this in all the movies now where the ghost hunters go out and they film it. If they film it with infrared, they see they're balls of warmth, really, but they emit light. I said, this is where they died. And so all we have to do It was the Whitney family, him and his wife. We just have to ask them to please leave. But they didn't want to leave because this was a beautiful place. They'd spent so much money on it, and they were noted for never leaving the house. I did the research on it. And so finally, we did a house clearing, which is really a very simple thing. It's not an exorcism. And you talk to them. If you know their name, you basically say, "You're dead. You need to move on. And by the way, your I am isn't here anymore. So all you're doing is hanging on to your rhythmic patterns of the past, and you just need to move on."
Yeah, the Whitney. I remember doing readings. Robert and I and a couple other people went there for the wife of Bob Guccione.
Mm.
He was the publisher of Penthouse magazine. It was this glamorous, posh party, and we were doing reading. Beautiful place, but yeah, it's legendary, that home. All the stuff that goes on there, and there's so many of these places in Detroit that I hope we can get into some more of these stories. We're running out of time, but I don't want to belabor the point, but that people have to take their spiritual life seriously, and it's something that's good for all mankind. And I want to thank Dr. Gabriel here for his heartfelt contributions over the years. And mind you, he was not being compensated for all this, and it's not fun. And so, if we can try and live more consciously, perhaps that will help.
I'll tell you a couple more stories.
Okay.
I moved into Indian Village, which was a burial ground. No one would believe me. It was the first racetrack, or the second one built in America for these for the Motown. These people building cars. But they built it. They built the racetrack there because nobody wanted to be there because everybody knew it was an Indian burial ground. Well, I taught at the Detroit Waldorf School, and I've told the story how literally I would see the ghosts' footprints walking in front of me as they would depress the carpet and these floors. And I knew this the whole time I was there, but I became the person in charge of the boiler. And so we redid the boiler. And as we did, we found the bones of children. And these had these big doors, the old tile. And so literally, there were children who were killed, who were thrown in this boiler, but their bones dropped down beneath the gas. And we found them, we had them tested, and they were children. And they even gave us an estimate of how long ago it was. But throughout Indian Village, it is so filled with so many haunted houses. You can't believe it. I think you were in the Stone House when I lived in the Stone House,
Mhm.
one of the most haunted places, because the woman who lived there, as I was saying, the three oldest houses that were right inside of what was Fort Detroit, they took one of them when Walter Russell was the head of Detroit Iron Works, and he then became the captain of a ferry that went back and forth between Detroit and Windsor. He moved all that house, took it apart, these glacial stones, numbered them, moved them down to Indian Village, and built it in mirror image. Then he died on the Detroit River, and then his son died, and I believe even the second son died. And so this lady, I had seen her from the day one, almost every single time I ever passed this house. She'd either be going out happy in all white to a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage, or she'd be all in all black, standing or in a wheelchair at the front window. And I just, every time I'd go by, hi. Find out later, long after I moved into that house, and the people that I was working for, they bought a lot of these houses. Matter of fact, I looked up last night to find some names of these, and three of the houses that they consider the most haunted houses in Detroit's history were houses that the people I worked for owned. And one of them was this house. And then we found out that in a wheelchair, she entered an elevator that was open, but there was no elevator there. And she fell down from the highest floor of the Book Cadillac building downtown in an elevator to her death. Well, she had put an elevator in the house after her husband and sons died. And when you would go to the bottom of this elevator in this haunted house, she was always sitting there. And so literally I'd take people who, wanted to have, some kind of spiritual experience of a ghost. I'd take them and I'd say, well, listen, this is the best I can do for you. I'd open this door to this dead elevator shaft and say, what do you see there? And they say, I don't see anything. So it was very peculiar. But this, you can't even believe all the things that she would do in that house. She'd open this door every night from the main master bedroom to go out to the widow's walk to look at where you could look at the Detroit River. And no matter how many times we nailed that door shut, it opened itself at night. No matter how big a nail I put into the floor, and so some people wanted to live in the house with me after it burnt. As they were selling it, the very minute they were selling it, the house started on fire. And I lived 2 doors down, so I was the first person there, and this house is on fire. And, basically, afterwards, a few months, the insurance guy's there, and I said, "Well, I'll give you" I forget what I offered him, X number of dollars for the house for the people I work for. So we bought this house, and I moved into the house. I lived in the house for a couple years, and every single time anyone was in that house alone, you would hear her wheelchair. You'd see her messing with you, trying to get into your room with the door. I had to put big cinder blocks in front of my door and even lock. She'd break the lock, open the door. And it was terrifying, actually. But right behind it was another convent where the nuns who had been raped by priests who got pregnant could no longer stay in the other convent. So they moved into this house. The entire time I was there, 20 years, uh, there were at first there were a few nuns there. I knew this because I talked to the lady who'd bring them food because I wanted to get into this house. I wanted to find out why. I wanted to find out what was going on and see if I could help. And right across the street from them was a house where a rich guy had a mistress, and he got her pregnant, and she had a girl baby, and then he dumped her, and so she committed suicide. And then I found this out much later. So a series of 3 women with a girl child lived in that house from the time it was built. And the third one became a friend of mine because she was moved out. She'd gone crazy and her daughter had gone crazy, and they moved their stuff out on the sidewalk. And I said, "Well, bring your stuff over. You can put it in my garage." I became friends of theirs, got into this house, and it took years. The house usually sat empty for years. No one would buy it. They'd go in there and they'd have a weird feeling. So literally, the house I lived in, the convent, this lady's house, this scorned mistress's house, were right in a row. And then to the left and right of me, my neighbors were killed. So when you get into this strange scenario that you're on a burial ground, and then horrible traumatic things happen, and sometimes these ghosts don't leave for a long time. I could never get rid of the ghost in the stone house. Never was able to stop the ghost that was in the convent or stop the ghosts that were in the scorned mistress's house. But to this very day, they still will tell you these are haunted houses in Indian Village. But there's a lot more there. There's all kinds of haunted houses because all around you were neighborhoods where there was crack houses and people were getting killed left and right when in those days Detroit was called the murder capital of America. So there was all this traumatic stuff. So no matter where I moved, even as a child, as an adult, I always ended up bumping into these things, and I felt obligated to try to do what I could to help. But sometimes there's nothing you can do. You can pray, you can fast, you can try to be as pure as you can possibly be. But in the end, you may or may not be able to help. And unfortunately, I, of course, left the Jesuits because of a lot of horrible things that were going on. But in the end, even later, they still would call me and ask me to, help out with these situations or to at least give them an assessment and so on and so forth. And then later, it became that the Mayflower Bob would give me a call. Somebody needs a house clearing. Would you be willing to do this? And I'd chat with him on the phone and go out and try to help with these kind of things. So what I'm trying to say is, first off, there's no ghost that can harm you. They're harming themselves, and they were harmed, and that's the reason that they are stuck. And there's no haunted house that can possess you. There's no ghost, even if they pass right through your body, that can harm you in any way. And unfortunately, though, there is evil that is perpetrated on people to this very day, because the Catholic Church hasn't stopped what they've been doing for thousands of years as the oldest institution around. And it's a matter of really you having discernment in this age. You don't really need a church. You don't need a priest to mitigate for you. You don't need an exorcism. If you needed an exorcism, you would know it because you'd know who the demons were because you invited them in yourself. So this is kind of the backdrop that you need to be able to understand what then John and I uh, got exposed to for decades and decades of people, begging for help, begging for spiritual help, and yet going about it all the wrong way. So I'm sorry. Please don't play this for people who are weak-hearted or are fearful, and just understand that the only power that I ever had in any of this was to let the love of Jesus Christ move through me to see if we could help. But in some cases, there was no help that could be given. And in other cases, they were very easy to help eradicate. And I'm not going to go into all the other ones because they're very complicated, long stories in many, many cases. But mind you, anything that you look up for a haunted house or haunted places in Detroit, I was connected to them in all those years that I was doing those kind of things and trying to do it out of a spirit, not out of Catholicism, but out of a spirit of Christ that is really centered in love.
Yeah, that was excellent. And again, this is not easy for Douglas to unearth some of this content, but I think in the long run, it's going to have a beneficial effect even for him. And there is people in the church that are like our friend here, Father Solanus Casey, who was a good friend of my grandmother's, and I was able to be blessed by him on numerous occasions, baptism and all of that. And I remember talking about him with Cardinal, well, he was Bishop Maida at the time, about they were working towards his canonization, which was eventually accomplished during Pope John Paul II, who was a good friend of our dear friend Ariel. And so there's a great and abiding respect we have for genuine article. But they're, like in most wholesome institutions, become infiltrated by dark forces. That's the place that for them is a major coup. If they can take over some venerable institution and pervert it, that's going to make them as happy as can be. But it's important to keep in mind that Christ is infinitely more powerful than the adversaries. I want to thank Douglas, and I want to thank his wonderful, industrious wife, Tyler Gabriel, for making this possible. And I hope you'll join us in the next episode of Interview with an Exorcist.